I needed money. Nothing desperate, but enough to take any temporary job that paid well. That's how I ended up at the Hargrove farm. A friendly older couple needed help with daily chores. Milking cows, feeding the pigs, harvesting vegetables, simple stuff. The pay was decent, and they offered a comfortable room for workers staying on site. But there was one rule: I was never to enter the third barn. I didn't think much of it at first. Plenty of farms have off-limits sheds or storage areas, whether for safety reasons or business secrets. But something about the specific barn unsettled me. It was old, looked barely used, yet it was always locked with a massive rusted padlock. Stranger still was how the Hargroves avoided even looking at it. On my third night there, a storm rolled in. The couple had gone into town for supplies, leaving me alone on the property. I was lying in bed, almost drifting off, when I heard a strange noise outside. At first, just a low creak, like something shifting in the wind. I ignored it, assuming it was a branch snapping, but then came the second sound. A muffled thumping, soft at first, then louder. It was coming from the third barn. A chill ran down my spine. Maybe an animal had gotten trapped inside. But then I remembered the Hargroves' words, "Never enter the third barn." I shut my eyes, trying to block it out, but the knocking wouldn't stop. With each heavy thud, my heartbeat quickened. The rain hammered against the roof as I sat up, my breath coming faster now. The knocking had changed. It wasn't just random thumps anymore. It had a rhythm. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 3 more. Like someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. I swallowed hard, telling myself it had to be the wind or something loose inside. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and grabbed the flashlight I kept on the knitstand. Just a quick check. That was all. If it was an animal stuck inside, I'd let it out. No harm done. I hesitated at the door, listening. The wind howled through the trees, but the knocking had stopped. For a second, I considered going back to bed. But then, just as I turned to sit back down, another sound reached me. A whisper. Faint, but unmistakable. "You have the key?" My stomach twisted. That wasn't the wind. That was a voice, and it came from inside the third barn. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone. But I knew where the key was, hanging right there in the kitchen. My hands were sweating as I reached for it. I didn't want to go out there. But something about that whisper, it didn't sound like a demand. It sounded like a plea. The key felt cold and heavy in my hand as I stepped onto the porch. The storm had eased up a little, but the air was thick with humidity and the ground was slick with mud. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the barns lined up in the distance. The first 2 looked normal, just weathered wood and rusted metal, but the third barn, something about it felt wrong. The way it stood there, slightly apart from the others, as if the land itself didn't want it. The wind had knocked some of the rain off the roof, leaving dark streaks down the old wood, like something had been crying inside. I forced myself forward, my boots sinking slightly in the mud with each step. The closer I got, the more my chest tightened. I wanted to turn back. Every fiber of my being screamed that I shouldn't be here. But then I remembered those scratches, the deep grooves I had noticed on the outside of the barn earlier in the day. They hadn't meant much to me at the time, just wear and tear. But now, in the beam of my flashlight, I could see them clearly. They weren't just scratches. They were claw marks. Long, uneven gouges in the wood, as if someone or something had been trying desperately to get inside rather than out. My fingers clenched around the key as I stood there, staring at the claw marks. The air felt thick, like the humidity wasn't just from the storm, but from something else, something pressing down on me. My breath came out shaky, and I told myself to turn around, to go back inside and lock the door. But then I heard it again. "You have the key?" The voice was barely more than a breath, but it came from inside the barn. Not loud, not aggressive, just waiting. My stomach twisted. I should have run. I should have thrown the key as far as I could and forgotten I ever heard anything. But my hand was already moving, already sliding the key into the rusted lock. The click of the padlock snapping open made my heart slam against my ribs. The barn door groaned as I pulled it open just enough to slip inside. The smell hit me first. Damp earth, rotting wood, and something sweet like overripe fruit. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the shadows. I swallowed hard and swept the beam across the room. Nothing. Just old hay bales and wooden beams covered in dust. But then I saw the floor-deep, dark scratches in the dirt, like someone had been dragged. My pulse pounded in my ears, and that's when I noticed the most terrifying thing of all. The scratches didn't lead to the door, they led away from it. I felt my stomach drop as I followed the scratches with my flashlight. They trailed toward the far end of the barn, disappearing behind a stack of old wooden crates. My breathing was shallow now, every part of me screaming to leave, but my feet moved forward anyway. The air was wrong in here too still, like the walls were holding their breath. I reached the crates, hesitated, then shifted one aside just enough to shine my light behind them. The beam caught something pale fingertips, barely visible in the dirt. My heart stopped. Someone had been back here. Someone had tried to claw their way out. I stumbled backward, my boots scraping against the wooden floor, sending dust swirling up into the air. My flashlight flickered again, and for half a second, I thought I saw something shift in the corner of the barn, a shape just beyond the reach of the light. No, I was not staying to find out what it was. I turned toward the door, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, but as I took a step, the floor beneath me creaked, loud, too loud, and then the whisper came again, right behind me. "You have the key." I froze. The whisper had been too close, right at my ear, like someone was standing behind me. But I knew there was nothing there. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, but I was too afraid to turn around. My body felt like it wasn't mine anymore, locked in place, listening to the silence stretch out. Then the floor creaked again, not from me. Something else had moved. The flashlight flickered once, twice, then cut out completely. Panic surged through me as I smacked the flashlight, trying to get it to work. Nothing. The barn was pitch dark, and I was blind. My breathing was too loud, ragged, and uneven, and in that suffocating blackness, I heard it breathing, slow, raspy, deliberate. Right in front of me. My body reacted before my brain did. I lunged for the door, but my foot caught on something, and I went down hard, my knee slamming into the dirt. The key flew from my hand, skidding across the floor. And then I felt it. A slow, deliberate exhale against the back of my neck. Something was crouching behind me. Every muscle in my body locked up. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The air behind me felt heavy, like whatever was there was pressing itself closer, waiting. My mind screamed at me to run, but my limbs wouldn't obey. Then, click, the flashlight flickered back on for a split second, just enough to cast a weak glow across the barn. And in that brief moment, I saw it, a hand. Not an animal's paw, not some old piece of rope, a hand, pale and thin, fingers unnaturally long, resting inches from my foot. My stomach twisted. It hadn't been there before. It had moved. I scrambled forward on my hands and knees, lunging toward where the key had fallen. My fingers dug through the dirt, heart hammering, pulse in my ears so loud it drowned out everything else. My hand finally closed around cold metal, but before I could push myself up, I felt it a touch. Light at first, barely there, then firm. Fingers curling around my ankle. No, no, no. I kicked wildly, my heel connecting with something solid, and a sound ripped through the barn, a wet, choking gasp, like something trying to speak but unable to. My body finally obeyed the panic, and I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My only focus was getting out, getting to the door before whatever was in that barn could stop me. My feet barely found traction on the dirt floor, slipping in the loose straw as I lunged forward. The key was still clutched in my fist, and as soon as I reached the door, I threw my weight against it. It wouldn't budge. My breath hitched. No, no, no. This wasn't happening. The door had swung shut behind me, but it wasn't locked. I had to push. I pressed harder, shoving with everything I had, and the wood groaned against my weight. Behind me, something shifted. A slow, deliberate movement, like someone rising to their feet. My heartbeat pounded in my throat as I forced the door open, just a crack enough. I squeezed through, practically throwing myself outside. The night air was ice cold compared to the suffocating heat inside the barn, but I barely registered it. I spun, reaching for the door, ready to slam it shut. But before I could, something from inside pulled it closed. Not the wind, not me. The heavy wooden door shut with a deep, final thud, and then silence. I stumbled backward, gasping for air, my legs shaky beneath me. The rain had stopped, but the wind still howled through the fields, making the barn creak softly, like it was breathing. My hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped the key. My mind raced. What just happened? Had I imagined it? No, no. That hand, that voice, that thing inside, it had been real. And it had been waiting. Then, as I stood there staring at the barn, something else happened. The padlock, the one I had taken off, it was back on the latch. I didn't put it there. I never locked it. My stomach twisted. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps as I stepped back again, putting more distance between me and that thing inside. And then, just as I turned to run back to the house, the whisper came one last time from the other side of the door. You have to stay. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't stop. I just ran. My boots pounded against the wet ground as I sprinted back toward the house, my lungs burning with each ragged breath. The farm felt different now, like I had stepped into a place that wasn't entirely my own anymore. The other barns, the empty fields, the swaying trees in the wind, they all felt wrong. Like everything had shifted just slightly, enough that I could feel it but not explain it. I didn't slow down until I reached the porch. My fingers fumbled with the door handle, slick with sweat and rain, before I finally threw it open and slammed it behind me. I locked it twice. My back hit the wooden door as I tried to catch my breath. The house was quiet, too quiet. I listened. Nothing. No wind, no animals outside, no creaking floorboards. I should have felt safe, but I didn't, because even though the barn was locked again, even though I was back inside, I knew I had let something out. I stood there, my back pressed against the door, trying to steady my breathing. Think, just think. The Hargroves, they knew. They had warned me. Never go in the third barn. But why? What the hell had they locked away in there? My hands were still shaking as I gripped the key, the metal digging into my palm. The thought of keeping it made my stomach turn. I didn't want it. I didn't want any of this. A creak inside the house. My breath hitched. I forced myself to move, creeping toward the hallway that led to the kitchen. Please, let it be nothing. But as I turned the corner, my blood ran cold. The key rack, the one where I had taken the barn key from, it was empty. The key was no longer in my hand. I looked down, heart hammering. When had I dropped it? My pulse pounded in my ears as I scanned the floor, the table, the counters, but the key wasn't there. It was gone. I backed away from the kitchen, my skin crawling. The key was gone. I had just been holding it. I knew I had. My fingers still felt cold from the metal, but now it had vanished. My chest tightened as I scanned the room again, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe I dropped it. Maybe I was just panicking. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had taken it. A sound broke the silence. A soft tap. My head snapped toward the front door, dread curling in my stomach. Another tap, then another. Knocking. Slow, steady, rhythmic. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. Exactly like before. My breath hitched. No, that's impossible. I locked that barn. The padlock was back. Nothing could have followed me. But as I took a step closer, my blood ran ice cold. Because the knocking, it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from inside the house. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The knocks, they were inside. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. My pulse pounded in my ears as I turned, forcing my feet to move. The hallway stretched ahead of me, dark and wrong, like it had gotten longer somehow. The knocking continued, 3 slow taps, a pause, then 3 more. I knew that rhythm. It had been coming from the barn. But now it was here, with me. I swallowed hard, forcing myself forward. The sound was coming from the guest room, the one the Hargroves had given me. My stomach twisted. Had I left the door open? I couldn't remember. My fingers hovered over the knob, my breath shaking. Don't open it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to get out of the house, to run. But I had to see. I had to know. Slowly, carefully, I pushed the door open. The room was dark. Empty, except for one thing. The key. It was sitting on my pillow. I stared at the key, my pulse hammering in my throat. It shouldn't be here. I had lost it. Something had taken it, and now it was back placed neatly on my pillow, like an invitation. My body refused to move, every muscle locked in fear. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, like something else was in here with me, watching, waiting. Then the bed creaked. Not from me. A slow, drawn-out sound, like something shifting just beneath the mattress. My mouth went dry. No. I took a step back, my foot barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The air felt wrong, charged with something unseen, something that had been in the barn, and now it was here. A whisper, so soft I almost missed it, hurled through the room. You shouldn't have opened it. Every hair on my body stood on end. The whisper wasn't distant anymore. It was close. Too close. My chest tightened as I stared at the bed, my mind racing. There was something under there. I wanted to run, to get out of this house and never come back, but my body refused to move. The room was too quiet, too still. Then the bed creaked again. A slow, dragging sound. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and bolted. Screw this. I ran down the hallway, nearly slipping as I hit the living room. My fingers fumbled with the front door lock, but my hands were slick with sweat. Hurry, hurry, hurry. My breath caught as I finally yanked the door open, expecting to be greeted by the cold night air, but instead I stopped dead. The Hargroves were standing on the porch, waiting. I nearly collapsed from relief. Oh my God, I gasped, stepping toward them. Something's in the house, but then I saw their faces. They weren't surprised. They weren't confused. They already knew. Mrs. Hargrove shook her head, her expression unreadable. You opened it. Her voice was calm, but there was something underneath disappointment. Mr. Hargrove let out a slow sigh, like a man who had seen this happen before. I took a shaky step back, my pulse pounding. What was in there? My voice barely came out. Neither of them answered right away. Then Mr. Hargrove muttered, almost to himself, "It always finds a way." A chill ran down my spine. It always finds a way? My stomach twisted as a terrifying thought crept into my mind. The key, the knocks, the whispers. This wasn't the first time. I took another step back, suddenly feeling like I'd made a terrible mistake by coming outside. The Hargroves weren't relieved to see me. They were waiting for me. My breath came faster now, my hands still shaking. What do you mean? It always finds a way? I asked, but I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Mr. Hargrove looked at me, his eyes tired, resigned. We told you not to open it. His voice was quiet, but firm. You let it out. The word sent an icy stab of fear through my chest. Let it out. Not in. Out. I shook my head, my stomach twisting. I didn't. There was. I couldn't even form a sentence. I wanted them to tell me this was a mistake, that I had imagined it all. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had been trapped in that barn, and now it was free. The wind howled through the fields, but the Hargroves stood completely still, watching me. I felt sick. This wasn't surprise. This wasn't panic. This was something worse, acceptance, like they had expected this to happen. Like they had been through this before. I swallowed hard. We have to go back. We have to... What? Lock the barn again? Try to fix something that was already too late? The words died in my throat as Mrs. Hargrove shook her head. You don't understand. Her voice was almost sad. It's not in the barn anymore. My body went cold. My hands clenched into fists as I forced myself to ask, then, where is it? The silence stretched between us. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Mr. Hargrove answered, It follows the one who opens the door. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. It follows the one who opens the door. My mouth went dry. I wanted to deny it, to call them crazy, but deep down, I already knew it was true. I had felt it. The breath on my neck, the touch on my ankle, the whisper in my room. It was with me now. I shook my head, my breathing uneven. No, we can lock it back up. We can. But Mrs. Hargrove just looked at me, her face lined with something that wasn't quite pity, wasn't quite regret. You don't put it back, she said softly. You pass it on. My stomach twisted. Pass it on? I didn't like how that sounded. What does that mean? My voice cracked. Mr. Hargrove glanced at the barn, then back at me. You'll understand soon. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't want to understand. I took a step back, shaking my head. Pass it on? My chest tightened. No, I'm not. I stopped myself because I didn't even know what I was refusing. But I could see it in their faces. This had happened before. And whoever had opened that barn last had passed it to me. The night felt suffocating now, the air thick with something unseen. I turned, my body tense, expecting to see it standing in the doorway or behind me in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the wind, just the silence, but somehow that was worse. I swallowed hard. What happens if I don't? My voice was barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hargrove's lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Hargrove just stared at me, waiting. Then, from behind me, inside the house, came 3 slow knocks. The knocks echoed through the night, soft but deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. It was inside. My legs locked up, my body refusing to move. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't. Mr. Hargrove exhaled through his nose like he'd heard the sound too many times before. You don't have much time. His voice was steady, but there was something else beneath it, something that made my stomach twist. I finally forced myself to turn toward the house, my heart slamming against my ribs. The door was still open from when I ran out. The hallway beyond it was dark. Too dark, and in that darkness I swore I saw movement, a shifting of shadows, something waiting. A chill wrapped around me, colder than the night air. What happens if I don't pass it on? My voice came out hoarse, like I already knew the answer. Mr. Hargrove's eyes met mine. Then it stays with you. A sharp shiver crawled down my spine. It stays with you. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts. I looked back at the house, at the darkness that felt too deep, too unnatural. The air around me had changed, charged, heavy, waiting. The thing I had let out wasn't lurking in the barn anymore. It was in there, with me. I turned back to the Hargroves, desperation rising in my chest. How? My voice cracked. How do I pass it on? I hated myself for asking, but I had to know. I couldn't live like this, Mrs. Hargrove's expression didn't change, but I swore I saw the slightest shift in her eyes, relief, like she knew I'd ask eventually. Mr. Hargrove just nodded. You'll figure it out. The porch light above us flickered. Then, from inside the house, another sound, a slow, dragging step, like someone pulling themselves across the floor. My stomach twisted into knots. It was coming. I felt like I was suffocating. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to figure it out. But the Hargroves had made one thing clear: there was no undoing this, no locking it back up, no running from it. It was mine now, unless I did what they had done. Unless I passed it on. Another sound from inside, closer this time. A shuffling, dragging noise, like something pulling itself across the wooden floor. My skin prickled. I took an instinctive step away from the house, but the wind was howling now, and it felt like the whole world was closing in. I turned back to the Hargroves, my voice raw. I couldn't even finish the sentence. Mrs. Hargrove held my gaze, then finally spoke. "Someone has to open the door." My stomach dropped. My body turned cold. That was it. I had to make someone else open it. My mouth went dry. Someone has to open the door. It was so simple, so cruel. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared at the Hargroves, but they weren't looking at me anymore. Their job was done. They had passed it on. I took a shaky step backward, my whole body trembling. No, I can't do that," I stammered. But deep down, I already knew the truth. It wasn't about what I could or couldn't do. It was about time, and I was running out of it. The front door of the house stood open, the dark hallway yawning before me. The sound inside had stopped. It was waiting. My fingers twitched at my sides, my breath coming fast and shallow. I thought of the key, how it had found its way back to me, how the whispers had started the moment I touched it. A new thought crept into my mind, a terrible one. Who had opened the door for the Hargroves? I turned back to them, but they were already walking away. Just like that. No goodbyes. No apologies. They didn't need to say anything. They had done what they needed to do, and now it was my turn. I watched the Hargroves disappear into the dark, my chest tightening with something I couldn't name. Dread? Hate? Understanding? It didn't matter. They were gone, and I was alone. A gust of wind rattled the porch. I turned back to the house. I didn't want to go inside, but I knew I had to. It was waiting for me. The front door still hung open, the hallway stretching into blackness. My legs felt stiff as I forced myself forward, one step at a time, until I was standing in the doorway. The air inside was thick, wrong. I swallowed hard, my fingers brushing the wood of the doorframe. My mind was screaming at me to run, but I knew there was no point. It wouldn't let me leave. Not until I did what I had to do. My eyes drifted to the guest room, the one where I had found the key. The door was wide open now. The bed, the floor, the air itself, it all looked the same. But I felt it. It was in there, watching. I stepped inside, my hands clenched into fists. My breath trembled as I whispered, "What do you want?" Silence, then 3 knocks, not from the walls, from inside me. My whole body seized with terror as I felt it, a weight, a presence, something pressing from within my own skin. Like something had crawled inside me the moment I opened that barn. It was never following me. It was in me. My knees buckled, my vision blurred. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud, frantic, desperate. And then, in a whisper so close it might have been my own voice, it answered, "Find the next one."